This video is in paid partnership with Mubi, a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/girlonfilm. I watched Smile yesterday and it was everything I wanted and more. There was a lot of Naomi Scott doing this, a lot of this, and even a little bit of this. It was a perfect, gunky popcorn flick. And it brought the question to the forefront of my mind. Are we finally over elevated horror? And if so, what comes next? The horror genre is a microcosm of the general film industry, and this is exemplified by shifting trends in popularity, the phases of the mainstream, if you will. In broader film and TV, we've seen booms in high fantasy, stoner comedies, and we seem to be on the tail end of the comic book film epidemic. In horror, we've had our own separate categories running the gauntlet for most favourable subgenre, with different decades taking fairly definable, idealised qualities. And these categories tend to run much broader than the nature of the horror, such as supernatural, psychological, or creature feature. It's more about the trends of the filmmaking over the beasties within. Of the waves of horror, some phases that stand out to me are the slow, gritty horrors of the 1970s, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Wicker Man, The Exorcist, and the original Halloween. They're dead serious and visually captivating dramas with nightmarish cores, captured on beautiful, grainy film. The 80s saw peak slasher popularity with continued Halloween films and the Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and Sleepaway Camp franchises. Horror of the 90s isn't as easy to define. By this point, horror films had a structure and a lot of tropes, and the period is often boiled down to the meta nature of Wes Craven's first Scream film, although that came out in the latter half of the decade in 1996. But I think it might be more broadly accurate to say that the films were increasingly psychological and character-focused. Silence of the Lambs, Seven, The Craft, Candyman. These films felt more grounded in reality than their predecessors, and a little gothy, maybe. Now we move into the 2000s. It's no secret here that I am a huge fan of this era of horror. These are the movies that were coming out when I was a kid, whose video cases I would hide from in Blockbuster. I had my dad pick me up from a sleepover in 2008 where we watched Saw 2 because I was absolutely terrified, and those girls continued to bully me for the next 2 years. Basically, at the time, I hated all of it, but now it has this powerful, nostalgic hold over me that scratches an itch nothing else does. The word I'd assign to the 2000s is trash. The trash era, if you will. I've already said if you will twice, and we're about 2 minutes into this video. We got lots of low digital quality, bad acting, nudity, a rise in torture porn, gore, and a lot of remakes, which I think is a factor that fits the trash mold by way of the supposed moral bankruptcy of remaking classics. Although I actually like remakes, and you can watch this video next to find out more about why. And all of these phases aren't just incidental. They're a response both to the socio-political and cultural state and a response to what came before them. The ideas injected into our horror and the way we present it can explore, invert, play up, satirize, and distract from the world around us. 80s horror, for instance, was recognizably impacted by the generally agreed upon morals of the time, with naughty sex havers dying left, right, and center, and only virgins surviving the night. I'd suggest that the sickly, greenish, gritty look of noughties horror was a response to glittery pink pop star consumerism. The horror aesthetic as a representation of counterculture was the antithesis of popular culture. And this is important because what's popular in wider popular culture and what's popular within horror haven't always lined up. But elevated horror of the 2010s changed that. Thanks to elevated horror, in the eyes of many, the genre pivoted from niche, cringe, immature, and nasty to classy, the stuff of intellectuals. Horror of the 2010s was more than just socially acceptable, but outright popular. Elevated horror is, to partially quote the 10th Doctor, a wibbly-wobbly term. It's used frequently but rarely defined, so let's start with getting on the same page. What do we all mean when we say elevated horror? Elevated horrors tend to be high-concept, emotionally complex stories grounded by realism in their visual presentation and performance style. I think we use the word elevated, a word that in this context means a higher rank or greater intellectual value. I really sounded like Lemony Snicket just then. We use elevated to distinguish these films from the average horror movie of the 2000s. As I've said, this time period was known for a particularly trashy vibe. Films were cheap-looking, poorly acted, crammed with as many cleavage and arse shots and bikini scenes as possible, for no real reason. Director Eli Roth in particular has the demeanor of a 12-year-old boy high-fiving his friends over seeing a naked woman through a window. It doesn't make you look like you get bitches, Eli. Frankly, it's quite bitch repellent. So compared to the early 2000s, the horror of the 2010s like The Babadook, The Witch, and Hereditary suddenly seemed so serious. They felt like real films that wanted to do more for their audience than get them horny and make them jump. With many of them, you could take away the horror and are left with a really solid, respectable drama film. Other films that would fit the mold include Get Out, Raw, Mother, Us, Saint Maud, and Suspiria. And it's not perfectly defined by the decade, as many of the best-known elevated horrors skew towards the end of the 2010s and even into the 20s. The First Smile came out in 2022, but I would consider it to meet the key qualities of elevated horror, and there are films like The Menu or The Invisible Man that you could argue go either way. But it was during the 2010s that certain trends were solidified as the desirable norm. Serious subject matter reigned supreme, with applauded horror talking trauma, mental illness, race, politics, and feminism. These topics have almost become their own subgenres, particularly trauma horror and societal horror. But I think they are core to a film being considered an elevated horror. It was all about having something to say, which, as it tends to, leans to much weaker imitations from other filmmakers trying to find something to say. Some new angle, some seething commentary, and when it doesn't work, it really doesn't work. See 2021's Karen. While a lot of these films are big conceptually, they all feel very grounded. Even something like Get Out, which also operates as an amazing comedy and doesn't really have the aesthetic qualities of a lot of other elevated horrors, is made to feel as real as possible. In film in general, we've trended towards realism for quite a long time now. For a filmmaker to achieve real life, to replicate something honest and true, using everything from dialogue to hair and makeup styling, is upheld as the golden standard. Think Call Me By Your Name and Boyhood. And why is that? It might sound obvious to say that we want films to feel real, but it's very much our current contemporary rubric, and it's not actually something that's always been considered important. Back in ye olde days, theatre performance was large and over-articulated in order to read at the back of a building. And this translated into the acting of early cinema. Even films from as late as the 60s still retain an uncanny melodramatic quality that was seen at the time as proper acting, although now it seems pretty silly. Over time, as filmmaking techniques developed across all areas, cinema simply began to resemble real life more. We could build better sets, do better sound, have more detailed costumes, and I think this encouraged filmmakers to strive for realism in all areas, including performance. As a famously cheap and, in my opinion, unfairly considered low-end genre, the need for horror to meet these same ideals wasn't expected. But the 2010s turned that around. Elevated horror established that there was no reason not to see Oscar-level acting in horror, from Toni Collette to those two freaky-ass twins in The Witch. Grounded, raw, powerful performances meant audiences were going on a real emotional journey, feeling everything the character is feeling, making the fear even more tangible and deep-rooted. This feel of real, of course, also affects the aesthetics of these films. Elevated horror films have a certain look. It's obviously not completely homogenous, as there are elevated horror films that lean into an art house aesthetic, but in general, the cinematography is intentional and artistic, and often fairly reserved, with still shots and slow pans. The color palette is all grays, blues, and browns. They are almost dull looking, but clean. And again, this is all to replicate the prestige dramas of the 2000s and 2010s, and maintain the appearance of being a quote-unquote serious film. Interestingly, some of the less positively received films from the latter half of this era, like Antlers, The Lodge, and The Turning, were criticized heavily for trying to achieve the elevated horror status aesthetically and in their subject matter, but failing to bring in other elements of good filmmaking. All of that said, realism is often used to exemplify how well made something is and how successful it is at being objectively good, even if that's bogus, and I think it undoubtedly contributed to the positive reception of films from this era. The tropes of horror seemed a little tired by this point in time, and the genre on a whole was considered unsophisticated. But now it had emotional value and could be taken seriously, which did probably connect horror to a much wider audience. Full disclosure, it wasn't until 2018 that I started watching horror. Shout out to The Witch. You changed everything for me. It isn't black and white as to what counts as elevated horror as much as I've tried to define it. But obviously, every one of these rules won't apply to every so-called elevated horror, and not every horror from this time period is considered an elevated horror on that basis alone. But in general, these are good films with top-level cinematography and acting. With many of them, you could take away the horror and are left with a really solid, respectable drama film. And as I said, I really do think this style was responsible for getting the wider public to take horror seriously. But the popular horror films of the past couple of years show that we're moving past this. We're tired of it, bored of it, find it pretentious and try hard. What we seem to love now are these popcorny, schlocky, simple horrors. Horror. Oh. I was being Jessica Lange. American Horror Story. I'm not saying horror. God, stop saying horror in videos. By the way, if it looks like I'm making a little less effort than normal with my appearance, it's because I have glandular fever and tonsillitis, and I had scabies, and then also a fourth worse thing that I don't want to talk about. I see the current popular wave as defined by simple premises, more humour, and a bolder look, which sometimes includes more kitschy, experimental visuals and editing. We're talking Smile 2, the X trilogy, Barbarian, the modern Screams, Malignant, Trap, even the Terrifier movies. Aesthetically, these films are colourful, bright, striking. Their pacing is fast and attention-grabbing, far from a slow burn. The performances are big, sometimes bordering on campy. They also go big with their gore. Violence obviously never went away with horror, but these films have no PG-13 Conjuring universe constraints and seem to be leaning ever more into practical effects with more desire to create exceptional and outrageous kills. As an evolution of elevated horror, they've maintained the high production value and quality acting, among other things, but reject many of the self-serious notions of sophisticated cinema, like overly complex emotional threads and muted color palettes. They seem to want to be colorful again, funny again, and ultimately, I think they just want to be fun again. I'm interested to see other people's thoughts on this, but to me, these films feel most akin to the horror of the 80s, where elevated horror has some more late 60s, early 70s seriousness a la Don't Look Now and The Exorcist. I think Ready or Not, which came out in 2019, which is actually only 1 year after Hereditary, was really important in establishing the audience desire for fun horror again. This film was a surprise success, gaining its creators' radio silence, massive attention, and drumming up interest in similar punchy comedic genre films. Ready or Not is the perfect example of pure entertainment, taking a simple, easy to understand premise and putting all of its most interesting ideas on the screen. No ambiguous backstories, no subtle themes, no fear of being too goofy or too gross. It's brilliant. And while I do keep spouting on about how simple these films are, I do want to highlight that simple films can still be great vessels for deeper ideas. X is a classic group slasher that contains many challenging ideas about sex and ageism. Barbarian handles misogyny and the way women walk through the world in a way that many other films have failed to. And I think a huge part of this is that the films don't hammer the complexity of the themes crazy on the nose. They just put them out there for audiences to pay attention to them if they want, or leave them if not. They almost have the same quality as great kids media. They may have complex layers, but the central premise is uncomplicated, understandable, and easy to watch, and entertainment is prioritized. These filmmakers are happy to let the entertainment, the comedy, the glam, the gore do the talking, rather than try and establish themselves as genius auteurs, tackling big issues or big ideas. It's interesting to compare the two Smile films here, because while I really enjoyed both, their reception was vastly different. Smile 1, which stars the excellent Sosie Bacon as a therapist, got a lot of flack for being a soulless trauma horror when it was released. Whereas Smile 2, featuring Naomi Scott as pop singer and icon Sky Riley, made a pretty big positive splash. While they have near identical premises, stressed out women followed by the same slowly walking, smiling entity, Smile 1's packaging is all elevated horror coded. Drab color grading, earnest performances, a heavy focus on the idea that the monster is a reflection of trauma. And when it came out in 2002, people were feeling pretty over this style. I remember many reviews dragging it for feeling hollow, even insincere in its representation of trauma, and just trying to hop into the trend of exploiting mental health struggles for scares. Smile 2 still deals with Sky Riley's own traumas, mainly struggles with addiction and the death of her partner, but it's not the film's sole focus or purpose. The pop star packaging keeps it high-paced and creates a completely different audiovisual environment for the Smile premise to thrive in. The changes made by the director, who headed both projects, Smile 1 and Smile 2, are a really interesting reflection of how horror is evolving in the 2020s. The film is fast, fun, and vibrant, and people really responded to this more high-energy horror. I feel like many of the current popular horrors are almost flipping the form of big, complex ideas packaged in realism that we had with elevated horror to simple ideas in crazy packages. They're not afraid of being seen as just good demon movies or good slasher films. They are leaning into simple fun. Megan, Bodies, 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 Orphan, First Kill. These films aren't trying to win Oscars. But speaking of Oscars, being bold and camp and crazy doesn't mean that they can't be recognised by prestige audiences. A film like The Substance, which is so goofy and uncouth, getting a Best Picture nomination is huge. It's truly quite unprecedented and marks a wider acceptance and appreciation for the thrills and spills of schlock. All that said, why are these simple, schlocky popcorn movies having such a moment? I think there are two answers. First being simply that everything has its time. We tire of certain styles and it's inevitable that people will look to new ideals and aesthetics eventually. The second reason runs a little deeper. In the elevated horror period, filmmakers were platforming and dissecting trauma, race, and politics, and I think it's all become a bit much. We're overseeing it on our screens in part because it's just overdone, but also because some of it is too real to be enjoyable. I've watched several great essays on blackness in horror and how several failed horror projects from black creators and otherwise have centered the trauma and suffering so much that they give nothing to black audiences other than painful reminders. I highly recommend Princess Weeks and Goldfro's videos on this. Point being, even in horror, paralleling real-life atrocities and prejudices is uncomfortable. And right now, when for so many people that stuff is present in their real lives, people want to escape. From our horror films, we just want the goods. We want to get lost in the cinema. We want to laugh and scream and feel adrenaline. As bad or juvenile as it might sound on the surface, we don't want our art to demand us to think. And if we are thinking, we don't want the messages forced down our throats. Same goes for how we feel. Being forced into places of emotional vulnerability is draining. What we're craving right now is escapism. Art is so often a response to the time, and unless your head is completely buried in the sand, you can probably agree we're living in increasingly dark times. There are hints of economic recession world over, frightening dynamics between world leaders emerging, and many long-running global conflicts coming to a head. And amidst all of that, homophobia, racism, and sexism is running rampant and destroying communities. Things aren't just down and drab, they're frightening and unpredictable. Basically, we are in the wrong timeline. We've seen serious times counteracted by bizarre art before, with art movement Dadaism being incepted in the wake of World War I, and with the crazy times we're in, I think we might find ourselves moving from just escapism to art that is increasingly dreamlike, surreal, and absurd. I think this kind of wacky, dare I say, phantasmagorical weirdness could manifest in horror in various ways. It might take horror cinema down a more camp, satirical, larger-than-life path like The Substance, or we might see a trend of more serious but abstract, ambiguous films like Beau is Afraid. Which, would you look at that, I just explained in my last video. Check it out, because it did not get a lot of views. We're already seeing boundary-pushing cinematography and editing with the likes of The Substance, Pearl, even Smile 2. There are choices made that break current story conventions like Barbarian's 3-story structure, which hard cuts to a singing Justin Long an hour in. These films are testing the waters, seeing how audiences respond to unusual framing devices and visual language. Language. Sometimes I don't think it works. Why did Smile 2 flip this shot upside down? Is it because it looks like a frown? Was it a necessary addition? I don't know. I just thought it looked like it was trying a bit too hard to be wacky, but it's nice to see filmmakers trying something, to take risks. Two outliers from the elevated horror period are Climax and Mandy, both from 2018, which again distort conventions of filmmaking, storytelling, and the visual identity of horror. I expect the positive reception to both these films likely challenged and inspired other filmmakers producing the current wave of popular horror. Yes, Argento did it first, but Mandy's saturated neon palette was absolutely repeated in coming years, and I think contributed to the more colourful look of recent horror. Mandy and Climax share an unusually slow-building structure and late title card, which is something that cropped up again later in Fresh and Evil Dead Rise. And aside from these elements, I think the actual ideas in horror will expand into more bizarre and ambiguous territory than we're currently seeing. All in all, I think that there's a possibility of a realism collapse across film genres, as we've been so fixated on it for such a long period. But I certainly think for horror, an inherently boundary-breaking, culture-shaking genre, that we can prepare for realism to be removed from its pedestal. And I think hard economic and political times will push us into more abstract and nonsensical horror cinema becoming the popular trend. So expect horror cinema to get even weirder, my friends. I, for one, am feeling pretty darn excited for it. And now a film recommendation to sate your weird cinema palette. If you're looking to expand your knowledge of cinema, old, new, and popular, then Mubi is for you. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from around the world. Every film is hand-selected by Mubi's curators, and they're available to stream anywhere, anytime on your devices. A recent gem I discovered is 1981's Fruits of Passion, a French-Japanese erotic film that has more than a touch of Yorgos Lanthimos to it, and even some strange Cronenbergian contraptions. And you can check out Fruits of Passion and try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/girlonfilm. That's mubi.com/girlonfilm for a whole month of great cinema for free. Thank you, Mubi, for sponsoring this video. Thank you to me for making it. And thank you to you for watching. Life is good. Horror is good. Breathe out. Bye. La 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 la.